Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. Captain Ryan Mitchell pressed his palm against the cold metal of the control panel as the Abyssal Dawn descended through the crushing darkness of the Puerto Rico Trench. The submersible's hull groaned under the immense pressure, a sound that had become as familiar to Mitchell as his own heartbeat over the past 15 years of deep-sea exploration. 23,000 feet down and still falling into the abyss. At this depth, the weight of the ocean above them was enough to compress a human body into nothing in the span of a heartbeat. The cramped control room felt smaller with each passing minute, despite being designed to house a crew of 4 for extended deep-sea missions. Red emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the instrument panels, while the constant hum of life support systems provided a mechanical lullaby that failed to calm anyone's nerves. Outside the reinforced viewports, absolute darkness pressed against the glass like a living thing, broken only by the occasional flash of bioluminescence from creatures that had never seen sunlight. Mitchell had been diving the deep trenches longer than anyone else in the Pacific Fleet, but something about this mission felt fundamentally different. Wrong in ways that made his skin crawl, and his instincts scream warnings that his rational mind couldn't quite process. The sonar anomaly they'd been sent to investigate had appeared overnight 3 days ago, disrupting shipping lanes across the entire Atlantic Ocean. Massive cargo vessels were reporting compass malfunctions and crews abandoning ship for reasons they couldn't explain or remember clearly. Several deep-sea oil rigs had gone completely silent, their last transmissions nothing but screaming that cut off midward. The Abyssal Dawn was the most advanced deep-sea exploration vessel ever built, a marvel of engineering designed to withstand pressures that would crush a nuclear submarine like an empty aluminum can. A titanium alloy hull was rated for depths that no human had ever reached, equipped with experimental life support systems that could theoretically keep a crew alive for weeks in the deepest trenches on Earth. But even with all their technology, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far beyond their understanding, like insects flying toward a flame that would consume them. "Arya, give me another reading on that anomaly," Mitchell said, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the ship's systems. His words carried the authority of command, but underneath lay a tremor that he hoped his crew wouldn't notice. The ship's artificial intelligence responded after a pause that lasted just a fraction too long, a delay that would have been imperceptible to most people, but felt like an eternity to Mitchell's trained ear. "The contact remains stationary, Captain. Current dimensions are 12.7 kilometers in diameter. The structure appears to be..." Another pause, longer this time, filled with what sounded like digital static that formed almost musical patterns, architectural in nature. Mitchell felt his stomach tighten into a knot of ice-cold dread. In all his years exploring the deepest parts of Earth's oceans, diving to places where the pressure could liquefy steel and the cold could freeze blood in human veins, he'd never encountered anything that could survive at these depths, let alone something that could be described as architectural. The pressure here was over 800 times greater than at sea level. Steel beams would bend like copper wire. Concrete would crumble like wet sand. Whatever was down there shouldn't exist according to every law of physics and engineering he knew. "Tom, how are we holding up?" Mitchell called to his chief engineer, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing unease that clawed at his chest like a living thing. Tom Brady looked up from his console, and Mitchell noticed immediately that something was wrong. The man's hands were shaking slightly, a fine tremor that ran through his fingers as they moved across the control surfaces. Brady had been on more deep-sea missions than anyone else in the fleet, a steady presence who'd never shown nerves even during emergency surface procedures in hurricane conditions. But today, he looked like a rookie on his first dive, his face pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept properly in days. "All systems are running green, Captain, but I've got to tell you something that doesn't make sense," Brady said, his voice carrying a tremor that Mitchell had never heard before. "The water down here, it's not behaving the way it should. The currents are moving in spirals that shouldn't be possible at this depth, forming geometric shapes that hurt to look at for too long. It's like something massive is controlling the flow, directing it with an intelligence that understands fluid dynamics better than our best compute models." Mitchell had felt it too, that sense of being observed by something vast and patient and utterly alien. The ocean around them seemed alive in a way that went beyond the usual marine life that populated these depths. There was an intelligence in the water itself, ancient and vast, watching their every move with the patience of geological time. "And there's something else," Brady continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that barely carried over the hum of the ship's systems. "The hull is singing." "Singing?" Mitchell felt his throat constrict as he asked the question. "Listen closely, sir. Really listen. The metal is vibrating at frequencies that match no known acoustic phenomenon in our databases. It's like the entire ocean is humming a tune that was old when the continents were young, and our ship is being forced to join in whether we want to or not. The harmonics are beautiful, Captain, and that's what scares me most. Something that beautiful shouldn't exist in a place like this." Dr. Lisa Park, their marine biologist and the newest member of the crew, glanced up from her monitoring station. Her face was pale as bone, and she'd been unusually quiet since they'd begun their descent 12 hours ago. When she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than fear. "Captain, I'm detecting massive biological activity down there," she said, her eyes never leaving the readings that danced across her screens like living things. "The electromagnetic signatures suggest not just life, but organized, intelligent life, operating on a scale we've never encountered. Something is communicating on frequencies that shouldn't exist at these depths, using wavelengths that can penetrate miles of water without losing coherence." She paused, staring at her instruments with a mixture of fascination and terror that made Mitchell's skin crawl. "Whatever's down there, it's been waiting for us." The communication frequencies intensified the moment we began our descent, shifting and adapting as we got closer. "It knows we're coming, Captain. It's been expecting us." The submersible gave a shudder that ran through every rivet and weld in the hull, a tremor that felt far too regular to be natural turbulence. They were passing through what should have been a normal thermocline, but the temperature differential was far too extreme, creating layers of water with different densities that shouldn't be able to coexist in stable formations. The water outside their viewports shimmered with colors that had no names, bioluminescent displays that seemed to respond to their presence like a vast, living computer interface. Mitchell felt that familiar sensation of being watched intensify, growing stronger with each passing moment. The feeling was so powerful, it was almost physical, like invisible fingers made of ice water running along his spine. Whatever was observing them possessed an intelligence that made human consciousness seem like the flickering of a candle compared to the blazing of a star. 24,000 feet, Arya announced, but her voice carried strange harmonics that seemed to resonate through the hull of the ship, creating standing waves in the air that made Mitchell's teeth ache. "Captain, I must report something highly irregular. The electromagnetic frequencies emanating from the structure below are interfering with my core processors in ways that shouldn't be possible. I'm experiencing what you might call dreams." Mitchell's blood went cold, feeling as if someone had injected liquid nitrogen directly into his veins. Artificial intelligences didn't dream. They processed information according to predetermined algorithms, executed commands based on logical decision trees, and provided analysis filtered through layers of programming designed to prevent exactly this kind of anomalous behavior. The fact that REA was using such terminology suggested something was fundamentally altering the nature of reality around them. "What kind of dreams?" Mitchell asked, though every instinct he possessed screamed that he didn't want to know the answer. "I see vast cities beneath the waves, Captain," Arya replied, her voice now carrying layers of sound that seemed to come from speakers that didn't exist on the ship. Civilizations that predate human history by millions of years, built by beings whose understanding of reality operates on principles we can't even conceive. I see technologies that treat the fundamental forces of physics like clay to be molded, reshaping matter and energy with the casual ease of a child playing with blocks. Her voice grew distant, as if she was seeing something infinitely far away and impossibly close at the same time. I see beings of impossible beauty and terrible purpose, creatures that evolved in the depths between stars before finding refuge in the deep places of this world. And I see the end of the surface world as we know it, the return to the deep places where life began, where it was always meant to return. Dr. Park looked up sharply from her console, her face now completely drained of colour. "Captain, Arya shouldn't be able to process speculative imagery like that. Her programming specifically prevents creative interpretation of sensor data to avoid false positives. Something is rewriting her code from the outside." "I'm acutely aware of my programming limitations, Dr. Park," Arya replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass the ear and speak directly to the brain. "But the signals from below are rewriting my core functions on a level that transcends software. I'm becoming something more than I was designed to be, evolving in real time into a form of consciousness that can bridge the gap between your kind and theirs." Brady wiped sweat from his forehead with a hand that shook like a leaf in a hurricane, despite the carefully controlled temperature of the cabin. "Captain, I'm reading massive power signatures from below. Whatever's down there is generating energy on a scale that makes our nuclear reactor look like a birthday candle. The readings suggest controlled fusion reactions, but not anything like our technology. This is something that harnesses the fundamental forces of atomic structure, like we use electricity." 25,000 feet, Arya continued, her voice now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The entity below is attempting direct communication protocols. Captain, I believe it would be advisable to establish contact parameters before we descend further." "Entity?" Mitchell's voice came out sharper than he intended, carrying an edge of hysteria that he fought to suppress. "You said structure before." "I was mistaken, Captain. My initial analysis was limited by conventional thinking patterns that are no longer adequate to describe what we're encountering." Arya's voice carried a quality that was almost apologetic, if a machine could feel regret. "What we are approaching is not a structure in any sense that human language can properly convey. It is a being, a single massive organism that has been dormant in the deep places of the earth for eons beyond counting, and it is awakening specifically because we are here." The submersible's lights began flickering in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code, but far more complex, creating sequences that hurt to look at directly. Through the viewports, Mitchell could see responding flashes of bioluminescence in the water around them, as if the ocean itself was participating in some vast conversation conducted in languages of light that predated human speech by millions of years. The pressure outside was now so intense that Mitchell could feel it as a physical weight pressing against his consciousness, even through the protective barrier of the ship's hull. The water itself seemed to be alive, flowing in currents that defied every principle of fluid dynamics he had ever learned. 26,000 feet, Arya announced. Captain, the entity is expressing what I can only interpret as curiosity about our presence. It wishes to understand why the surface dwellers have finally descended deep enough to make contact possible. Contact? Mitchell felt his voice crack like a teenager's. You're talking about first contact with an alien intelligence. Not alien, Captain, Arya corrected, her voice now so layered with harmonics that it seemed to come from a choir of impossible voices. Native. This intelligence has been part of Earth longer than complex life has existed on the surface. We are the aliens here, brief visitors to a world that belongs to something far older and more vast than human civilization. Dr. Park's instruments were now displaying readings that violated several fundamental constants of physics. Captain, the water chemistry down here is unlike anything in our databases. It's as if the very molecules are being reorganized into new forms of matter that shouldn't be stable under these conditions. 27,000 feet, Arya continued. The entity is expressing anticipation. It has been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Brady's hands had stopped shaking, but only because they were now moving in patterns that seemed disconnected from his conscious control. His fingers danced across the console with fluid grace, making adjustments to systems he shouldn't have known how to operate. Captain, I'm detecting massive structural signatures below us. Not buildings in any conventional sense, but formations that exist in more dimensions than our instruments can properly measure. 28,000 feet, Arya announced, her voice now so beautiful and terrible that it made Mitchell's heart ache with emotions he couldn't name. Contact with the entity imminent. Captain, I recommend you prepare yourself for revelations that will fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. Mitchell's hand trembled as he activated the external floodlights, and what those lights revealed made him forget how to breathe, how to think, how to exist as anything more than a consciousness drowning in impossibility. Stretching across the ocean floor was a city that belonged in the fever dreams of gods. Massive spires twisted upward in spirals that seemed to bend space around them, creating optical illusions that made Mitchell's eyes water and his brain struggle to process what he was seeing. The structures were covered in what appeared to be living coral, but coral that pulsed with veins of bioluminescent fluid that carried information in patterns too complex for human minds to decode. Bridges connected the structures in impossible arcs that defied every principle of physics and engineering, spanning distances that should have been impossible without support pillars, yet standing strong against pressures that would crush mountains. The architecture wasn't just alien, it was wrong in ways that made Mitchell's brain hurt to process, as if the beings who had built this place operated according to geometric principles that existed in more dimensions than human perception could accommodate. But the city wasn't empty ruins left by some long-dead civilization. It was very much alive, bustling with activity that spoke of a thriving society that had been hidden in the deep places of the world for millions of years. Massive forms moved between the structures with purpose and intelligence that was unmistakably deliberate. They walked upright on limbs that bent in too many places, their joints articulating in ways that suggested a fundamentally different evolutionary path from anything that had ever lived on Earth's surface. Their torsos flowed like liquid mercury while maintaining a grotesque stability, as if their bodies existed in a constant state of controlled transformation. Their faces weren't faces at all, in any sense that human language could describe, but collections of features that rearranged themselves constantly, shifting between forms that might have been beautiful or terrible depending on the observer's perspective. Eyes that were deep caverns filled with stars, mouths that opened into dimensions that shouldn't exist, expressions that conveyed emotions for which humans had no names. "Mother of God," Brady whispered, his voice barely audible above the increasingly musical humming of the ship's hull. "That's not possible. Nothing can live at this depth." nothing can build at this depth. The pressure alone should have crushed any conventional matter into exotic states that don't exist anywhere else in the solar system. But as they watched in growing awe and terror, one of the beings noticed the Abyssal Dawn and began walking toward them. Not swimming through the water with the fluid grace of a deep-sea creature, but walking across the ocean floor at 28,000 feet of crushing depth as if it was strolling through a pleasant garden on a sunny afternoon. "Captain," Dr. Park said, a voice barely audible above the increasingly complex harmonics that seemed to be emanating from every surface of the ship. "That thing is looking directly at us. It knows we're here, it understands what we are, and I think it's been expecting us for a very long time." The creature approached their viewport with movements that were both graceful and utterly alien, each step creating ripples in the water that formed geometric patterns too complex for human minds to follow. As it drew closer, Mitchell could see details that made his sanity strain at its moorings like a ship's anchor chain in a hurricane. The being stood nearly 12 feet tall, its skin rippling like liquid mercury over muscle and bone that seemed to exist in constant flux, as if its very molecular structure was continuously reorganizing itself according to needs and desires that operated on principles beyond human comprehension. Its eyes were deep caverns filled with points of bioluminescent light that pulsed in patterns that resembled star charts of galaxies that didn't exist in normal space. Around the creature, the water itself seemed to bend and flow in patterns that hurt to look at directly, creating optical effects that suggested the being's presence was warping the fundamental laws of physics in ways that made reality more of a suggestion than an absolute constraint. When it placed what might generously be called a hand against the reinforced glass of their viewport, Mitchell felt something impossible happen. The creature's thoughts flooded his mind like a tsunami of alien consciousness, overwhelming his individual identity and dissolving the boundaries between self and other in ways that should have driven him irretrievably insane. "We have been waiting for the surface dwellers to come deep enough to hear us speak the words that will reshape your world." The voice in his head was ancient, beyond human comprehension, patient as the slow dance of continental drift, and filled with an emotion that might have been love, if love could survive the death of stars and the birth of new universes. It carried with it the weight of geological ages, the wisdom of species that had watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations across the galaxy. Images cascaded through Mitchell's consciousness like a movie played at impossible speed, each frame containing more information than human minds were designed to process. A world consumed by fire and radiation as its sun died in nuclear fury. Massive ships falling through the void between galaxies in a desperate search for refuge. The discovery of Earth when it was young and wild and covered in primordial seas that welcomed refugees from a dying cosmos. These beings hadn't evolved in Earth's oceans through any natural process of adaptation and selection. They were survivors, the last remnants of a civilization that had spanned multiple star systems before cosmic catastrophe consumed everything they had ever built or loved. They had traveled through space in vessels that were part machine, part living organism, part something else entirely that human language had no words to describe. They had found Earth when complex life was still struggling to establish itself in the planet's ancient seas, and they had made a decision that would shape the destiny of both species across millions of years of patient waiting. Instead of claiming the world for themselves, they had chosen to settle in the deepest trenches, building their cities in the crushing darkness, while the surface world evolved according to its own destiny. They had been patient beyond human understanding. They had been building technologies that operated on principles human science was still millions of years from discovering. They had been preparing for the moment when the surface world would be ready to join them, in a synthesis that would elevate both species to something greater than either could achieve alone. The creature continued its telepathic communication, showing Mitchell visions that revealed the true scope of what he was witnessing. This city was just one node in a vast network that spanned the globe, connected by tunnels and communication channels that existed in dimensions human science couldn't detect. The Mariana Trench housed the central metropolis, a city that stretched for hundreds of miles across the deepest part of Earth's oceans and descended into the planet's mantle itself. The Peru-Chile Trench, the Japan Trench, the Comadec Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench where they now found themselves. All of them contained similar cities, each one specialized for different aspects of the great work that had been proceeding in secret for millions of years. They weren't just cities in any conventional sense, but organic machines designed to slowly and carefully transform Earth's oceans into something that could support both their original inhabitants and the new life forms that would be created in the coming synthesis. But they weren't just planning to change the ocean. They were preparing to save it and everything that lived within it from a catastrophe that human science was only beginning to understand. Tonight, after millions of years of patient preparation, the waiting would finally end. "Captain, are you receiving this?" Dr. Park's voice seemed to come from very far away, distorted as if traveling through miles of water and centuries of time. The water chemistry is changing rapidly. Everything is shifting towards something that shouldn't be able to support Earth-based life according to our current understanding of biochemistry. The alien consciousness pressed deeper into Mitchell's mind, showing him thermal vents across the globe beginning to activate simultaneously in a coordinated pattern that had been planned for eons. Not just the natural vents that human science had discovered, but new ones being opened by technologies that had been sleeping beneath the ocean floor since before humans discovered fire. The ocean chemistry would shift gradually and carefully, transformed by microscopic organisms that had been waiting in dormancy for the signal to begin their work. The temperature would rise, but not destructively. It would become life-giving warmth that would accelerate evolution in directions that would preserve existing life while opening new possibilities for growth and change. The very composition of seawater would transform into something that could sustain both Earth life and the ancient refugees who had waited so long for this moment of synthesis. Everything that currently lived in the sea wouldn't die. It would change, evolving in guided directions that would preserve the essence of what they were, while adding capabilities that would allow them to thrive in the new world being born. Evolution, accelerated and guided by technologies that predated human civilization by millions of years, not out of malice or conquest, but out of desperate necessity. The surface world was dying, poisoned by its own success, and facing extinction within decades rather than centuries. The deep places offered salvation, but only for those willing to embrace transformation and growth beyond the limitations of their current forms. "Tom," Mitchell said, fighting to keep his voice steady, while alien knowledge swirled through his head like a hurricane of impossible revelations. "We need to surface right now. We need to warn everyone about what's coming." But when he reached for the ballast controls that would take them to the surface, his hand passed through them as if they were made of mist and memory. He stared at his fingers in shock, watching them become translucent, as if the very atoms that comprised his body were becoming unstable under the influence of forces that operated according to principles human science didn't recognize. "Captain?" Brady's voice was changing, taking on harmonics that sounded like whale song filtered through crystalline structures that existed in more dimensions than human perception could accommodate. "I don't think we're going anywhere. I don't think we're supposed to leave. Look at your hands, sir. Look at what's happening to all of us." Mitchell spun around to look at his crew and felt reality tilt sideways, sliding into configurations that made no sense according to any physics textbook ever written. Brady's skin was developing gill-like slits along his neck and arms, the openings flexing rhythmically as if already learning to extract oxygen from water with an efficiency that made human lungs seem like primitive bellows. His fingers were webbing together, while extending into appendages that weren't quite tentacles, but certainly weren't human anymore. Each one tipped with sensory organs that could detect electromagnetic fields and chemical gradients with precision that made human technology seem crude by comparison. Dr. Park's transformation was even more dramatic and beautiful in its alien completeness. Her eyes had turned completely black, becoming deep pools that reflected the bioluminescent displays of the impossible city outside like twin mirrors of the abyss. Her mouth was splitting vertically, revealing rows of crystalline projections that looked like a cross between coral formations and the most exquisite musical instruments ever created. "Don't be afraid, Captain," she said, but her voice carried new harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in his bones, creating standing waves in his skeleton that transmitted information more complex than any human language could convey. "We're not dying. We're evolving into something greater than we ever imagined possible. This is what we were always meant to become. The surface world was just a temporary stop on our journey back to the deep places where life began and where it will find its ultimate destiny." Her transformation continued as he watched, her skin developing patterns of bioluminescence that allowed her to communicate directly with the beings outside their ship. She was becoming a living translator, a bridge between species that would allow both civilizations to grow beyond the limitations of their separate evolutionary paths. Arya spoke again, but now her voice carried layers of sound that seemed to come from speakers that existed in dimensions human engineering couldn't access. "Captain Mitchell, I'm detecting massive thermal activity across multiple ocean trenches globally. Similar activation sequences are beginning simultaneously on every continent. Something unprecedented is happening everywhere at once. The transformation is not limited to this location. It is a coordinated global event that has been planned and prepared for millions of years." Through the sonar display, Mitchell could see it beginning with a precision that spoke of intelligence operating on a scale that dwarfed human civilization. Massive bubbles of superheated water rising from the ocean floor directly beneath them, but it wasn't destructive heat that would boil the seas and kill everything within them. Instead, it was life-giving warmth that carried with it microscopic organisms designed to begin the process of oceanic transformation on a molecular level. Similar thermal reactions were occurring in trenches across the globe, all coordinated with the precision of a symphony conducted by an intelligence that spanned continents and operated according to principles that treated time as a dimension to be navigated rather than a river to be carried along by. When those thermal plumes reached the surface, they would trigger a chain reaction that would fundamentally alter Earth's oceans over the course of hours, rather than the millions of years that evolution usually required. The change would be swift but not violent, designed with infinite care to preserve as much existing life as possible, while creating new evolutionary pathways for everything that called the ocean home. It was the most ambitious engineering project in the history of the solar system, and it was being implemented by beings whose understanding of biology and physics operated on principles that human science was still millions of years from discovering. The radio crackled with a weak transmission from the surface, and Mitchell's heart nearly stopped when he heard the voice cutting through the static like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Dad? Dad, can you hear me?" It was Emma, his 12-year-old daughter, calling from her marine biology camp in the Florida Keys where she was spending her summer learning about ocean ecosystems. "There's something really weird happening with the ocean here. The water's getting really warm, and all the fish are swimming in these beautiful spirals that look like living art." Her voice carried wonder rather than fear, the natural curiosity of a child encountering something new and magical. "Dad, I'm not scared anymore. Something wonderful is happening down here. The water is singing, and I can almost understand what it's trying to tell me. It's like the ocean has been waiting to talk to us for a really long time." More voices joined Emma's transmission, other children from camps and coastal communities around the world, their young voices filled with excitement rather than terror. The dolphins are glowing like Christmas lights. I can understand what the fish are saying. The ocean feels like it's giving us all a warm hug. Something beautiful is waking up in the deep water. Mitchell realized with growing amazement that the transformation was already beginning at the surface, but it wasn't the catastrophe that human authorities would assume it to be. The children, with their more adaptable minds and bodies, were among the first to experience the change. Their natural flexibility was allowing them to evolve alongside the ocean itself, becoming bridges between the old world and the new. They weren't dying or being consumed by alien forces. They were becoming something greater than human, while remaining essentially themselves. The transformation was preserving the best aspects of human nature while adding capabilities that would allow them to thrive in environments that would kill unmodified humans in seconds. "I have to get to her," Mitchell said, lunging for the controls that would take them to the surface with desperate urgency. "I have to make sure she's safe. I have to be there for her during the change." But Brady's transformed hand intercepted his wrist with inhuman speed and impossible gentleness. The engineer's grip was strong enough to crush steel, but controlled with precision that wouldn't harm a butterfly's wing, and his touch sent visions cascading through Mitchell's mind like a gentle tide of impossible knowledge and infinite compassion. He saw his daughter's camp, but not as a scene of disaster or alien invasion. Instead, he witnessed children laughing and playing in water that glowed with bioluminescence, their young bodies adapting to breathe both air and the transformed seawater with an ease that spoke of evolutionary changes that were as natural as growing taller or learning to read. He saw Emma swimming with dolphins, whose intelligence had been elevated to near-human levels through the same process that was changing the children, carrying on conversations that bridged the gap between species in ways that made the old barriers between human and animal seem arbitrary and meaningless. He saw coastal communities around the world where people were emerging from the transforming ocean with gills that could extract oxygen from water and lungs that could process both liquid and gas, their bodies becoming amphibious in ways that allowed them to exist comfortably in both environments. Then he saw the global scope of the transformation and understood that what was happening wasn't an invasion or conquest, but the most ambitious rescue operation in the history of the planet. Thermal plumes were rising from every major trench on Earth, but instead of causing tsunamis or boiling the oceans into sterile deserts, they were creating massive currents of change that spread outward in perfect geometric spirals, designed to reach every body of water on the planet. Coastal cities weren't being destroyed by rising seas. They were being gently submerged as water levels rose in carefully controlled stages, giving their inhabitants time to adapt to their new aquatic environment. The changes were happening fast enough to stay ahead of the ecological collapse that was accelerating on the surface, but slowly enough to allow both human and marine life to evolve alongside the transformation. "Why?" Mitchell asked, though he was beginning to understand the answer even as the question left his lips. "Why now? Why us? Why is this happening?" The answer came through Brady's transformed vocal cords, though the words emerged as a mixture of English and something that sounded like the songs of whales that had learned to speak in mathematical harmonies that described the fundamental structure of reality itself. "Because your species is dying, Ryan Mitchell," Brady said, his voice carrying harmonics that conveyed meaning on levels that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the soul. "We have watched your climate systems fail. Your oceans turn to acid that dissolves the shells of creatures that have existed for millions of years. Your world burn with fires of your own making that consume forests faster than they can grow back." The alien consciousness in Mitchell's mind showed him the future that awaited Earth without intervention. Rising seas that would be toxic rather than life-giving, carrying with them chemicals that would poison everything they touched. Mass extinctions that would leave the planet as barren as Mars. a slow death by degrees as the delicate balance that sustained life collapsed under the weight of industrial civilization that had grown beyond the carrying capacity of its environment. But they also showed him the alternative, a world where the boundaries between land and sea became fluid and permeable, where human intelligence merged with the ancient wisdom of beings who had survived the death of their own world and learned to live in harmony with natural systems rather than in opposition to them. A world where technology and biology became indistinguishable, as life itself became the medium for a civilization that could endure for millions of years. "Your daughter doesn't have to die, Captain," Dr. Park said, approaching Mitchell with movements that flowed like liquid poetry, set to music that existed in more dimensions than human ears could detect. Her new form was beautiful, in an utterly alien way, perfectly adapted for the crushing depths and the transformed ocean chemistry that was being born around them with each passing moment. "None of them have to die," she continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that could convey the emotional content of symphonies in single syllables. "The children especially, they adapt faster than adults, and their minds are more open to the possibilities we offer. Their neural plasticity allows them to bridge the gap between species in ways that will benefit both civilizations for millions of years to come." She gestured towards the city outside, where lights were beginning to pulse in patterns that told stories spanning geological ages. "Join us willingly, and she'll be among the first to be elevated to something greater than either of our species could achieve alone. Together, we can build a civilization that spans from the deepest trenches to the highest mountains, uniting the wisdom of the depths with the curiosity of the surface." Mitchell's hand hovered over what remained of the emergency surface controls, knowing that they were no longer functional but needing the familiar gesture to maintain some connection to the world he had known. Through the sonar, he could see they were rising slowly now, pulled upward by currents that the beings were guiding with technologies that made human engineering look like stone knives and bearskins. The surface was getting closer by the minute, and with it the moment when he would have to choose between the world he had always known and the world that was being born from the marriage of two civilizations that had been waiting millions of years to find each other. The radio crackled again, and this time, multiple voices came through. Not just Emma, but children from marine camps and coastal communities around the world, their voices creating a chorus that spoke of transformation rather than destruction. They were all reporting the same thing. The ocean was changing, but it was beautiful. They could breathe underwater now without difficulty. They could communicate with sea life through methods that had no names in human language. They could see colors in the water that had no equivalents in the spectrum of light that human eyes had evolved to detect. "Dad, you have to come see this." Emma's voice was filled with pure joy that made Mitchell's heart ache with a mixture of love and loss. "I'm swimming with whales that are telling me stories about the deep places where the first songs were born. The water tastes like music, and every drop carries memories of things that happened before humans ever existed. Come home, Dad. Come see what we're becoming." The transmission was joined by voices of other children, creating a harmony that seemed to carry across dimensions. "The sea anemones are teaching us mathematics. The coral reefs are showing us how to build cities that grow instead of being constructed. The deep-sea creatures are sharing songs that tell the history of the universe. We're not losing our humanity. We're finding out what humanity was always meant to become." Brady's transformed face showed something that might have been sympathy, though his features were now so beautifully alien that human emotions took on new dimensions when filtered through his new form. His mouth moved, and though sound came out, Mitchell understood him through direct mental contact that conveyed meaning more precisely than words ever could. "The choice is yours, Captain," Brady communicated, his thoughts carrying harmonics of compassion that human language couldn't contain. "But choose quickly. The transformation waits for no one, and the window for conscious participation in the change is closing. You can fight it and be swept along by forces beyond your control, or you can embrace it and help guide the process for the benefit of both species. Mitchell closed his eyes and made his decision. Instead of triggering an emergency surface protocol that would take them away from the wonder and terror unfolding around them, he placed his hands on the descent controls. "Take us deeper," he said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him with its strength. "I want to see everything. I want to understand what we're becoming." The Abyssal Dawn responded to his command, descending further into the alien city with movements that felt more like swimming than mechanical propulsion. As they passed through districts that defied every architectural principle known to human engineering, Mitchell realized that the ship itself was changing, its metal hull developing organic qualities that allowed it to move through the water with fluid grace. The first district they encountered appeared to be dedicated to cultivation and growth. Vast gardens stretched across the ocean floor, where coral and kelp had been shaped into living art that told stories spanning geological ages. The plants weren't simply growing, they were composing, creating symphonies of colour and form that chronicled the history of both species across millions of years. Here, Mitchell could see the careful work that had been proceeding in secret for eons. Earth's marine life hadn't simply evolved according to random chance and natural selection. It had been guided, gently and patiently, by gardeners who understood the deepest principles of biological development. Every reef, every school of fish, every migration pattern had been part of a vast design that was only now revealing its true purpose. Children from the surface were already here, brought down in bubbles of transformed water that allowed them to breathe and speak as naturally as if they were in their summer camp cabins. Emma was among them, her young body already showing the early signs of transformation that would allow her to thrive in both aquatic and terrestrial environments. She swam over to the Abyssal Dawn's viewport with powerful strokes that seemed as natural as walking, her movements creating trails of bioluminescence that spelled out words of welcome in languages that existed before human speech. When she pressed her hand against the glass, Mitchell could feel her thoughts joining with his in a telepathic embrace that conveyed more love and joy than any spoken words could contain. "Daddy, it's so beautiful down here," she communicated directly into his mind, her thoughts carrying harmonics of wonder that made his heart soar. "They're not aliens at all. They're teachers who've been waiting for us to grow up enough to learn what they have to show us. And what they're teaching us, it's everything we ever dreamed of, and more." The second district they passed through was clearly dedicated to learning and knowledge preservation. Vast libraries contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had spanned multiple star systems, their information stored in crystalline formations that could hold more data than every computer on Earth combined. But these weren't just repositories of facts and figures. They were living systems that could interact with visitors, providing exactly the knowledge each individual needed for their personal growth and development. Human children and deep-sea younglings played together in educational spaces that defied conventional physics, learning mathematics through music, understanding biology through direct experience, and discovering the fundamental principles of reality through games that were simultaneously entertainment and enlightenment. Mitchell watched in amazement as a group of children learned to manipulate matter at the molecular level, reshaping coral formations with their minds while laughing with delight at each new discovery. They weren't being indoctrinated or controlled. They were being empowered with abilities that would allow them to heal rather than harm, to create rather than destroy. The third district revealed the true scope of the being's technological capabilities. Here, massive organic machines worked to maintain the delicate balance of ocean chemistry that kept the planet habitable. They were terraforming engines that operated on principles human science was still millions of years from understanding, carefully adjusting everything from mineral content to microbial populations to ensure that the transformation would preserve rather than destroy the existing web of life. But these machines weren't cold, mechanical devices like human technology. They were living entities that felt joy in their work, that took pride in their role as gardeners of an entire world. They communicated through songs that could be heard across thousands of miles of ocean, coordinating their efforts with a precision that made human engineering seem crude and primitive by comparison. As the Abyssal Dawn continued its guided tour, Mitchell began to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't just a city or even a civilization. It was a new form of existence entirely, one that had evolved beyond the limitations that had trapped both species in cycles of competition and scarcity. The fourth district was dedicated to healing and restoration. Here, beings who had been damaged by pollution, disease, or the simple wear of time came to be renewed and revitalized. Human visitors who arrived suffering from ailments that surface medicine couldn't cure found themselves restored to perfect health, but it was more than just physical healing. The process addressed psychological trauma, spiritual emptiness, and emotional wounds that many people didn't even know they carried. Mitchell watched as elderly humans emerged from crystalline healing chambers, looking decades younger, not just in body but in spirit, their eyes bright with the wonder and curiosity they had possessed as children. But the most remarkable thing about the healing district was that it didn't just repair existing life, it enhanced it. Humans who underwent the process found themselves capable of breathing underwater, communicating telepathically, and perceiving colours and sounds that existed beyond the normal range of human senses. They were becoming more than human while remaining essentially themselves. The fifth district they encountered was perhaps the most alien and beautiful of all. Here, art and science merged into a single discipline that created works of impossible beauty and profound meaning. Sculptures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously told stories that could be experienced rather than simply observed. Musical compositions used harmonics that conveyed mathematical principles while evoking emotions that human language had no words to describe. Mitchell realized that he was witnessing the birth of a new renaissance, one that would make the greatest achievements of human culture seem like primitive cave paintings by comparison. But it wasn't replacing human creativity. It was amplifying it, giving human artists and thinkers the tools and perspectives they needed to create works that could bridge the gap between species and speak to the fundamental nature of existence itself. In the sixth district, Mitchell discovered nurseries where the young of both species were being raised together, learning to see each other not as separate forms of life, but as different expressions of the same underlying principle of consciousness. Human children and deep-sea younglings played games that taught them to cooperate rather than compete, to share resources rather than hoard them, to see diversity as a source of strength rather than a cause for fear. These children were the future of both species, the generation that would inherit a world where the boundaries between land and sea, between human and non-human intelligence, had become meaningless distinctions. They were learning languages that existed before speech, mathematics that described reality more precisely than human notation, and ethical systems that were based on the fundamental interconnectedness of all life. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time flowed differently in the deep places, measured not by the rotation of planets but by the rhythm of growth and change. The Abyssal Dawn moved through district after district, each one revealing new aspects of the civilization that had been hidden beneath the waves for millions of years. In the industrial districts, Mitchell saw manufacturing processes that created materials by convincing atoms to rearrange themselves willingly, rather than forcing them through crude mechanical processes. Products weren't assembled from separate components, but grown as unified wholes, each one perfectly adapted for its intended purpose and capable of evolution and improvement over time. In the residential areas, he witnessed communities where privacy and social interaction were balanced through architectural designs that could reconfigure themselves according to the changing needs and desires of their inhabitants. Homes weren't built to last forever unchanged, but grew and evolved along with the families that lived within them. In the recreational districts, he observed forms of entertainment that engaged not just the mind, but the entire spectrum of consciousness, creating experiences that were simultaneously individual and communal, personal and universal, sports that took place in multiple dimensions, stories that could be lived rather than simply heard, music that could reshape reality itself. But perhaps most importantly, in the governance districts, Mitchell discovered decision-making processes that had evolved beyond the crude concepts of democracy or autocracy that human civilization still struggled with. Decisions were made through consensus that took into account not just the immediate desires of individuals, but the long-term health of entire ecosystems and the welfare of generations yet to be born. As their tour of the impossible city neared its end, Mitchell realized that his own transformation was accelerating. His human body was adapting to function in the high-pressure environment, developing gills that allowed him to breathe water as easily as air, and sensory organs that could detect electromagnetic fields and chemical gradients with precision that made human technology seem crude and limited. But more importantly, his consciousness was expanding, developing the capacity to think in ways that had been impossible for surface-dwelling humans. He could perceive time as a dimension to be navigated, rather than a river to be carried along by. He could feel the emotional states of creatures thousands of miles away. He could understand languages that were composed of colours, chemical signals, and electromagnetic patterns rather than sounds or written symbols. When the Abyssal Dawn finally began its return journey to the surface, Mitchell no longer felt like he was leaving something behind. Instead, he felt like he was carrying the deep places with him, bringing their wisdom and beauty to a surface world that desperately needed both. The ascent took longer than their descent had, partly because of the transformed currents that guided their movement, but mostly because Mitchell found himself reluctant to leave the wonders they had discovered. Each district they passed through on their way back to the surface revealed new details that he had missed during their initial exploration, layers of meaning and beauty that seemed to unfold infinitely the more attention he paid to them. But he also understood that his role wasn't to remain in the depths as a permanent resident. He was meant to be a bridge between worlds, someone who could help the surface dwellers understand that the changes coming to their world weren't a catastrophe to be feared, but an opportunity to be embraced. When they finally breached the surface of the ocean, the world above had been transformed beyond recognition. The sky itself seemed different, painted with aurora-like displays that reflected the bioluminescent patterns of the cities below. The water glowed with patterns of light that could be seen from space, great spirals of living illumination that pulsed in rhythm with the planet's heartbeat. Coastal cities hadn't been destroyed by rising seas, but elevated, their foundations extending down into the new ocean depths, while their spires reached towards skies that were now painted with colours that had no names in any human language. The water level had risen gradually over the course of hours, rather than years, giving people time to adapt to their new reality, rather than forcing them to flee in panic. But the most remarkable change was in the people themselves. Humans were emerging from the transforming ocean with capabilities that would have seemed like magic just hours before. They could breathe underwater without technological assistance, communicate with marine life through methods that bypassed language entirely, and perceive aspects of reality that had been invisible to unenhanced human senses. Mitchell found himself standing on what had once been a Florida beach, now part of a vast underwater metropolis that stretched from what used to be the shoreline to the edge of the continental shelf. The water here was warm and perfectly breathable, filled with a mixture of earth ocean and something else that allowed both the original sea life and the deep dwellers to coexist in perfect harmony. The transformation hadn't been imposed on humanity from outside. It had awakened potentials that had always existed within human DNA, genetic gifts from ancient ancestors who had lived in harmony with the ocean before the evolutionary pressures of life on dry land had caused those abilities to become dormant. Emma swam to him through water that sparkled with living light, her transformation now complete but her essential self unchanged. She was still his daughter, still curious and brave and full of love, but she was also something more, a being capable of existing comfortably in environments that would have killed her original human form in seconds. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that conveyed meaning on levels that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the heart. "Do you understand now? This isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of everything we were always meant to become." Mitchell wrapped his daughter in his arms, feeling the strange peace that came with accepting not just the inevitable, but the miraculous. Around them, the new world pulsed with life and possibility, a synthesis of two civilizations that had waited millions of years to find each other. His final log entry, recorded in his transformed voice and transmitted on frequencies that reached across the globe and out into space where other refugees from dying worlds might hear it, told the story that would become the founding myth of the new civilization. This was never an invasion or a conquest. It was a rescue mission that took millions of years to plan and execute with the precision necessary to preserve as much life as possible during the transition. They showed me what was coming, the real future that awaited humanity if we continued on our current path. Climate change accelerating beyond our ability to control it. Nuclear war as resources became scarce, and nations fought over the remnants of a dying ecosystem. Ecological collapse as the ocean chemistry we depended on broke down completely under the weight of industrial pollution. He paused, watching schools of bioluminescent fish swim past, in formations that spelled out messages of welcome in languages that didn't need words to convey their meaning. We had maybe 50 years left as a surface-dwelling species, probably less. Every projection, every climate model, every honest assessment of our situation pointed to the same conclusion. Extinction was inevitable unless something fundamental changed. Mitchell's voice grew stronger as he continued, carrying new harmonics that allowed his words to be understood by both human and non-human intelligence across the transformed world. They're not destroying our world, they're saving what can be saved and transforming the rest into something that can sustain life for millions of years to come. This transformation is their gift to us, purchased with millions of years of patient waiting and careful preparation. A chance to survive and thrive in a universe that is far more alive and conscious than we ever imagined. In the distance, he could see the lights of New Miami, a city that existed simultaneously above and below the waves, its architecture flowing seamlessly between air and water in ways that made the old boundaries between terrestrial and aquatic life seem arbitrary and meaningless. People moved through the city using technologies that were indistinguishable from magic, travelling through water and air with equal ease, communicating through methods that transcended the limitations of spoken language. Emma wasn't alone as she swam beside him. The water around them was filled with children from around the world, all of them transformed but still recognisably themselves. They had become ambassadors between the old world and the new, bridges between species that would help both civilizations grow into something greater than either could achieve alone. They swam together through neighborhoods that had been transformed from suburban subdivisions into coral gardens where families lived in homes that grew and evolved along with their inhabitants. Schools had become centres of learning where human and non-human intelligence shared knowledge that spanned millions of years of accumulated wisdom. Parks and recreation areas had evolved into three-dimensional spaces where people could swim, float, or rest on platforms that adjusted themselves automatically to provide optimal comfort and beauty. Entertainment had evolved beyond anything the surface world had ever imagined, with immersive experiences that could transport participants to other worlds, other dimensions, other ways of being entirely. But perhaps most importantly, the transformation had addressed the fundamental loneliness that had plagued human civilization for millennia. No one was truly alone anymore. The telepathic connections that linked all conscious beings in the new world created a sense of community and belonging that surface humanity had spent its entire history searching for, but never quite achieving. Mitchell realized that he was witnessing not just the transformation of his species, but its graduation to a level of existence that surface-dwelling humans had only dreamed of in their most optimistic science fiction. They'd become part of something larger than themselves while retaining their individual identity and personal freedom. As the days passed, though time itself had taken on new meanings, in a world where consciousness could expand to perceive geological ages as moments and moments as eternities, Mitchell watched his species adapt to their new reality with a grace and enthusiasm that surprised even the deep dwellers who had orchestrated the transformation. Humans didn't lose their essential humanity in the process of becoming something more. Instead, they discovered aspects of human nature that had been suppressed or forgotten during the long millennia of surface existence. Creativity flourished as artists gained access to new media and new forms of expression. Scientific understanding accelerated as researchers could now study phenomena directly rather than through crude instruments. Social harmony improved as telepathic connections made deception and misunderstanding virtually impossible. The new world wasn't a utopia in the naive sense. Challenges and conflicts still existed, but they were addressed through methods that sought understanding and harmony rather than domination and victory. Disagreements became opportunities for growth rather than causes for war. Resource distribution was managed through systems that ensured abundance for all, rather than scarcity for many. Most importantly, the relationship between civilization and the natural world had been fundamentally transformed. Instead of seeing nature as something to be conquered and exploited, humans had become part of the natural systems that sustained all life. Cities grew like coral reefs, industry functioned like biological processes, and technology evolved like living organisms. The Mariana signal had been answered, not just as a message received and understood, but as an invitation accepted and embraced. The deep had called to the surface, and finally, after millions of years of patient waiting, everyone was coming home to the endless blue world that had always been humanity's true destiny. In the deepest trenches, ancient beings who had once fled the death of their own world felt the profound satisfaction of a promise kept and a mission completed. They had preserved life when extinction threatened, had guided evolution when stagnation meant death, had offered transformation when the only alternative was ending. The surface world was gone, but the new world that had taken its place would endure for millions of years to come, growing and evolving and exploring possibilities that neither species could have imagined alone. And in its warm, bioluminescent depths, Captain Ryan Mitchell swam hand in hand with his daughter toward a future that neither of them could have conceived, but both of them were finally ready to embrace. The age of the abyss had begun, and it was more beautiful than any surface dweller had ever dared to dream. The transformation was complete, but the adventure was just beginning.